Thank you so much. So tonight we're going to be delving more into our pillar of policing and criminal justice with our highly recommended business leader and civil rights activist, Tiffany Williams community engagement and movement building council with Southern Leadership, the Southern Center of Human Rights. And so I posted Tiffany's background here because it's so extensive, but there are a couple of things I wanted to highlight for you. So Tiffany joined the SCHR in 2018 as a community engagement and movement building counsel. She has a she's a civil rights and criminal defense attorney, and she's been so since 2008. She was a public defender with the Atlanta Judicial Circuit public defender. And now she's a solo practitioner since 2011. She has done many things, one being on the Atlanta Fulton County pre-arrest diversion program that she was on since 2017. And she is a member of Mayor Keisha Lance Bottom's Progressive Agenda Working Group, which is responsible for populating and convening commissions focusing on 4 key social justice issues: criminal justice reform, housing affordability, homelessness, and workforce development. So as you can see, her initiatives are highly aligned with ours. And she is co-chair of the PAWG Criminal Justice Reform Commission and sits on Mayor Bottom's transition team, criminal justice reform, criminal justice reform subcommittee. And in her work, she has a coalition of several attorneys and community organizations she works with, and they were critical to securing bail reform for Mayor Bottom's first month in office. So that's pretty huge also. She is also the Ebenezer Baptist Church Social Justice Ministry chairperson, and she works to build bridges between grassroots social justice organizations, the legal community, and faith-based institutions. And finally, if that's not even it, to add to her repertoire of experience, she's the deputy director of the National Institute for Teaching Ethics and Professionalism and an adjunct professor of law at the Georgia State University College of Law. Now, that's just a snippet of her background. I did add the links to her background. It is absolutely amazing. Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us, and we turn it over to you.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. So what I do for a living, and I feel blessed to do it, is honestly what I was doing for a really long time for free. So when I graduated from law school, I just wanted to be a career public defender, and I was organizing and doing public defense. And at some point, it just wasn't sustainable. Being at community meetings until 7, the jail until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and then, wanting to have a family and all of those things. So I stopped working for the public defender's office, despite loving that work, so that I could organize. And so I'm excited to talk to you about defund the police, or the defund demand, because there's so much conversation around it, often as though it's a new demand, when it really isn't. And so what I hope to do is to talk about the origins of the demand over time, in the context of policing as a remnant of chattel slavery, or American policing as a remnant of chattel slavery. And so I will share my screen. Oh, let me make sure I go back to the first slide before I do that. Right. And I have a 6-year-old upstairs who's promised to get herself ready for bed as I do this. And I might have to go on mute to tell her to get the Uber Eats off of the doorstep and then come back. But all right, so what do people mean when they say defund the police? And so the first thing that I always like to raise is that budgets are moral documents. The way that we spend our money reflects our priorities as a society. And so this is a quote from Dr. King, around the freedom budget. And this is toward the end of his life. So you see, this is a quote from 1966, toward the end of his life, talking about like Dr. King had a very robust class analysis, not only a robust race analysis. And so it says the freedom budget is essential if the Negro people are to make further progress. It is essential if we are to maintain social peace. It is a political necessity. It is a moral commitment to the fundamental principles on which this nation was founded. And so we say all that to say, you have to put your money where your mouth is, right? And sometimes in church, we say you give your time, your talents, what's the other T? Your treasure.
Treasure.
So this is your treasure. So where are we putting our treasure? So people often say the first question is, well, what are you going to do about crime without police? If there are no police, then there will be anarchy. And so it's important to note that unsolved violent crime is at a rate of about 45%. So in fact, police, number one, most of the time respond once a criminal act has taken place. And even when that happens, only 45% of violent crime is solved. And that number is even lower for property crime, right? And so this is not to disparage police necessarily, but to address the concern that somehow social order is maintained because of police, when in fact, of developed nations, US policing is very disturbing. Mass incarceration, so the United States, our one little country, we warehouse 25% of the world's prisoners. We have a very high rate of incarceration. So the origins of policing, so many of you know that policing in the South emerged from slave patrols, right? So police were never initially meant to apprehend or correct the behavior or address the behavior of white folks. In the very beginning, it was created to apprehend enslaved Africans and bring them back South. And then at the same time, well, a little bit later, you started to see police emerge in places like Boston as a response to merchants who no longer wanted to employ their own private security. And so I say that just so we know that policing as it is in this country was created to enact social control on particularly enslaved or recently emancipated African people. So some of you may have heard over the summer about 8 Can't Wait. Well, 8 Can't Wait was a series of proposed policy initiatives that really came out of sort of like the first Obama term, 21st century policing, which we have seen over time did not actually address police violence, right? Did not significantly impact police violence in a way that wouldn't have given you a summer 2020 that was similar to the year that we got in 2015, right? When Michael Brown was killed. So Micah Herskind, and some other young people. Micah is actually my policy associate at Southern Center. I have no idea how we managed to hire him, but he is a young college graduate who left the federal defender as a paralegal to come work with us at Southern Center. Micah and some of his friends came up with this campaign, which was really, it's not even a campaign, it is a reframing of the narrative around state violence to address reducing the size of the police state, right? And so you see the first demand being defund the police, but it's sort of like in the meantime, demilitarize communities. We have a militarized police presence in Black communities in this country. And when I say that, that means significant dollars go to purchasing SWAT gear, even tanks in some communities. We have a small town, I don't know who might be from Atlanta, but the city of South Fulton was a recently formed city, I think 3 years ago. And so South Fulton, one of the first things they did, so it's all of much of unincorporated Fulton County that's like south of Atlanta. So I live literally like a quarter of a mile from that line. One of the first things they wanted to do, their police force wanted to do, was buy a tank, right? It is this idea that we are at war with our communities. When I served on Mayor Kasim Reed's police chief search committee, one of the questions that we asked is, do you believe that you're at war with your communities? And all but one of them said no. I think they kind of knew that maybe for this particular panel, they didn't need to say that they were at war, but that's a real thing, right? There's war on drugs. You know, we don't often talk about the war on poverty because there isn't one, but there are all these wars. And when you have wars, you have enemy combatants. And when you have enemy combatants, you don't have to treat them like human beings, right? So this is a mechanism to dehumanize entire communities. We talk about getting people out of jails. That was important this summer, especially when COVID, well, really during the spring, COVID hit and people began to die from the virus. And there were hot spots in jails and prisons. And if you go to Southern Center's website, if you go to schr.org/news, you'll see that we, every week, we update you with the number of people who have been infected or die from COVID in jails and prisons in Georgia specifically. And there are many organizations that do that. And that's very morbid, but it's important because there's so many people sitting in jail, not because of public safety, right, but because of systemic oppression and the very targeted policing in communities of color and poor people and poor communities. Repeal laws criminalizing survival. That's just discussing quality, what people call quality of life ordinances. Do we have to jail people for jaywalking, for urinating in public, for panhandling, or do we need to address the needs of those folks instead of responding to the harm, to the harm that really has been visited upon them through putting them in cages? Community governance, safe housing, and care and not cops. So that was just like a narrative shift that some young people did that really caught on. It was, and it wasn't expected. They did not expect it to catch on the way that it did, but it did. All right, so here I just give you an example. So one tangible thing you can do is where you live, pull your city's budget. Pull your city's budget and figure out how much money you're spending on police. And it's not just limited to the line item for the police department. There are all kinds of other expenses that might be spread to human resources and all of these other line items. And those of you who are good with numbers will do a better job of figuring that out than me. But there are lots of data shops that help you do this work. And so I'll paste, at the end of the presentation, I'll paste a link. The Vera Institute of Justice has cataloged the police budgets for most major cities in the United States. And I think that the number from Vera was like $276 million or something crazy like that for the police department in the city of Atlanta. So here it was 217, but it ended up being like 226. Check the door. All right, so I want to use Atlanta as a case study to talk about this conversation. So before we talked about defund, before we used that language, what we were saying was invest, divest, right? Because we wanted it to be clear that the ballooning police budgets in most major cities have deprived other public resources of funds that are needed. And that over time, because of austerity and other things, we've defunded a lot of things. Like we have defunded public education, right? And we can talk about going from a teacher to student ratio of like 1 to 11 that is in some places 1 to 40, right? We know that we have significantly defunded education. We have defunded public behavioral health resources. For the most part, they are scarce, they are inaccessible. As a public defender, the facility to which I could send my clients to get treatment in Georgia at the time, we referred to it as Bainbridge. It was, for some of my clients, the wait to get a bed in Bainbridge was longer than the sentence. So they would say, well, I'll just take the 6 months because it's a year wait for me to get to Bainbridge. All right, so in Atlanta, around 2013, Michael Julian Bond, who is actually Julian Bond's son, proposed that we banish sex workers from the city of Atlanta. And he wanted to do it like upon their second conviction for sex work. And I think at the time didn't even address the people who are soliciting sex from them. And so some of us had already gotten together and have been working on all of these other police accountability measures. And we said, look, there's a program in Seattle called SOAP. And SOAP seeks a holistic approach to addressing the needs of sex workers or people who are engaged in sex work and other sort of like underground economies driven by poverty. And could you look at that program? Because if you want to address the needs of sex workers, banishing them from the city limits isn't the way to do it. Where are they going to go and how are they going to get there? Well, what we ended up doing we took legislators to Seattle, and we were at least able to like slow the moving bus of like banishment as though we're in the 1400s. And so by 2015, we were able to build a program that was even more progressive than SOAP. So SOAP required someone to be arrested. We were able to design a program, and when I say we, I mean over 70 people. There was a design team, an advisory board, and all of the things. We were able to design a program that permitted police to refer people to treatment instead of arresting them. So we created the design team, and I think, so this is the picture of the design team, and it was a partnership between all of these folks. The police department, city council, public defender's office, both 4 different prosecutor offices, direct service providers, public health experts, and anyone that you can imagine. And through that design team, we were able to launch PAD. And so PAD was at that time mostly grant funded, and the pull from the police budget was really allocating officers to actually refer people to the program. And so it was a pilot, and it only included parts of the city. And so this is certain zones, mostly the downtown areas, the areas where businesses were concerned, we want to hide our poor people, we want to hide our addicted people, we don't want them to be seen. And so it's most of the downtown and sort of like midtown commerce areas where the pilot areas, along with the Auburn Avenue corridor. And so this is from our first meeting. And so this shows you the range of the things that you have to consider when you talk about an invest, divest framework. So we had to explain how the criminal legal system worked. Lots of people don't understand that. We still have a city council member right now who doesn't know the difference between jail and prison. And she's been a council member like since the 90s. And so making sure that people understand the way that the criminal legal system works so that we could identify points of intervention to divert people from cages, right, from jails. And so once we were able to get the program up and running, and what's important is that pre-arrest diversion does not exclude people based on charge. Officers can divert cases as long as they believe that that they have probable cause to arrest a person based on an act committed due to poverty, an unmet behavioral health need, or addiction, right? And so, because we didn't want to say, well, you can't divert the 17-year-old who sells drugs because he's not addicted to those drugs. If this is a behavior that you want to address, and if you want to provide resources, then we should be able to divert a sale of cocaine case just as well as we can divert some of these. And so, but what you see is we still aren't there with officers being willing to divert those people. These were the most frequently diverted cases: possession of a controlled substance, which is just basically a possession of a drug, drinking in public, pedestrian violations, urinating in public, criminal trespass, being in a park after midnight, disorderly conduct, theft by shoplifting less than $100, and obstruction of an officer misdemeanor, which means running and not hitting. What this demonstrates, so if these were the PAD numbers as of summer 2020. So you see this number, right? So drug offenses accounted for this many of the charges in the pilot area. But we don't have that many diversions. So at the time that PAD was running in that pilot area, police were diverting like 1/6 of the number of people they could divert. And what that demonstrates to us is a really deep-seated investment in incarceration, even when there are other options available, right? And so how do we address the desire to jail when that will not remedy the problem, even among our police officers. This summer, we were successful in getting PAD expanded. And one of the really exciting things, so the vision for PAD from the beginning was showing that there was another way. So what happens when an officer diverts someone? They call the PAD office. It runs around the clock pretty much now. And they call, and PADs purchase the vehicles, and they have what they call care navigators. They don't call their social workers, they call them care navigators. And they bought a retired taxi, and they show up to the scene, and as soon as they show up, there's a handoff with the police officer. The person is able to get into the PAD mobile, as we call it, and do an intake interview. And it's a housing first model. So churches and other C3s have donated dollars for hotel stays, as well as apartments for families. And so it's a housing first model. So to house the person, and if that person has open cases, at that point, the care navigator in the PAD office reaches out to the appropriate prosecutors or public defenders to see if there's a way to keep the person in care instead of them being jailed. All right, so this is just what I just talked about. So while we were kind of getting PAD up and running, we had a series of shootings in Atlanta, police killings. In 2017, a young man named DeAndre Phillips was killed by the Atlanta Police Department. The officer's name is Yassine Abdulahad, and to my knowledge, he still works for APD. At the time that Mr. Phillips was killed, he was in an APD parking lot. He had taken a cousin to our public records annex to pick up something, I think a police report. So he took a cousin to the police station and fell asleep in his car. At some point, plainclothes officers approached his car where he was sleeping because they said they smelled marijuana. They asked Mr. Phillips to exit the car. He exited the car, and at some point, the conversation went left. He got back in his car. He drove away. An officer jumped in his car and shot him in the head. This is Mr. Phillips and his daughter. When we first heard about the case, the officer wrote a report and said the reason that he killed Mr. Phillips was because he had jumped in the window of the car. Mind you, this is marijuana. He jumped in the window, and Mr. Phillips took off while his body was hanging out of the car. And so he had no choice but to shoot him because his life was in jeopardy. Well, it turns out that the officer had opened the door and jumped in his car and shot him in the head. We found this out because we demanded the footage, and after some pressure, they were forced to release the surveillance video from the outward-facing camera at the police station. And so the pressure from the killing of Mr. Phillips, along with so much brutality related to drug enforcement, allowed us to get marijuana reclassification passed. And interestingly, Mayor Bottoms at that time was the council person, and she was the lone no vote against reclassifying marijuana as a non-jailable offense. In 2018, Mayor Bottoms takes office and passes bail reform as her first piece of legislation. This was after lobbying by community organizations, and those community organizations actually presenting that legislation, drafting that legislation and presenting that legislation to Mayor Bottoms. Also in 2018, my friend, Oscar Kane, was killed by the Atlanta Police Department. Oscar was killed by an officer who was not wearing a body camera. A good bit of Oscar's organizing history in Atlanta was around body cameras. And so I raised Oscar's case and I raised DeAndre Phillips' case to say, during a time of robust police reforms, we still consider to see police killings, even in a city that is governed primarily by Black people. And as with Oscar, so he was such a young, he worked, his first organizing job was with the League of Youth Voters. And he was such a pure spirit. And Atlanta failed him, right? And to a great extent, we as a community failed him, because once he tried to go to college and he couldn't stay in college. He was actually arrested while in college because he was breaking into his own apartment. You know how in school you leave keys everywhere. And he had broken into his own apartment and got into a scuffle with a police officer. And as a result of that, wasn't able to stay in school. He came home and he just couldn't, he couldn't find a job that paid well. He had 2 children and ultimately was living in a very poor area and was killed by a police officer at like 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of the woods. And this officer was not wearing a body camera. And this officer is also still employed by the Atlanta Police Department. In 2019, Women on the Rise is an organization led by Black women who are formerly incarcerated. They launched a campaign years ago to close the Atlanta City Detention Center because it was built for the Olympics. And so after the Olympics, it was really never full. And so they ran this campaign, was able to get Mayor Bottoms to sign legislation to erect a task force to close the city jail. The city jail only housed people for city ordinances. This is not the Fulton County Jail, which is a jail where people go when they are accused of committing felonies. And so in 2020, so that's just an idea of the road of criminal legal reform and police reform are wholly inadequate without seriously examining the amount of resources that we pour into communities as opposed to those resources that we pour into police departments. I think there are only 2 years in my organizing history where the Atlanta Police Department didn't get a significant budget increase. And that was because Mayor Reed at the time was wholly against most reforms, but he was building up the city surplus funds. And one of the first things that Mayor Bottoms did, despite her progressive talking points around policing, was to give our police officers a raise. And this is, after passing bail reform, but passing no other legislation that was recommended by my law firm and others to make people more successful when they were facing criminal charges. And so this summer was just a groundswell of movement that really, you can ask whether sort of complacency around Band-Aid reforms gave us the moment that was the summer of 2020. After the killing of Rayshard Brooks and after I think President Obama did a call to action asking for cities to launch use of force advisory councils. So Mayor Bottoms launched ours and I co-chaired that along with a comrade named John Rapping who runs Gideon's Promise, which some of you may have heard about as an organization built for supporting public defenders. And so, we were at this moment, John and I were at the moment of trying to figure out how do we discuss a divest invest framework while co-chairing a city advisory council. And they're not going to be down with abolition, like we know that, right? And so reform exists on a continuum all the way from, just sort of like very carceral humanism all the way to abolition. And we know that most cities are nowhere near this, the end of the continuum that is abolition. But what we did was talked about 2 things, transformative vision, right? And non-law enforcement responses to crisis. Let's see, is that here? I never remember okay, so here we are. Develop a plan to enable alternative first responders for situations where other expertise is beneficial and/or police presence is not critical. And then commit to eliminating performance evaluation systems and disciplinary actions that incentivize officers to make unnecessary arrests. And then committing to incentivizing diversion and disincentivizing, we have de-incentivizing, but I kind of don't think that's the word, certain categories of arrests. Okay, so this was a practical way to build a divest invest framework into an existing city program. 1, get rid of anything that says that police officers make more money, get more bonuses, get more beats, or more off-duty jobs because they arrest more people. Right now, that is the status of Atlanta, unless they've changed their system where you get 5 points for arresting a child, 5 points for a felony arrest, but you get 0.5 points So your arrests get multiplied by 0.5, which means they're reduced, they're cut in half. If you go to a scene and don't make an arrest, that call is multiplied by 0.5, but you arrest a child, it's multiplied by 5. Right? So we told the city that they should get rid of that system. That's a quota, no matter what we call it, right? That is, and that also drives police violence. Rayshard Brooks, if the officer had been incentivized to divert Rayshard Brooks, who was sleeping in a Wendy's parking lot, as opposed to arresting him, right? Because conceivably he'd done what needed to be. If you were driving and you're impaired, you pull over and go to a parking lot, right? So that's one of the things that we said. Then develop alternative responders. Not, a police officer doesn't need to respond to every scene. There is a program called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, in places, and it was a community-led response system where people can receive a social worker or someone else instead of an armed police officer. And in communities where that happens, crime actually goes down. And then commit to incentivizing pre-arrest diversion and other forms of diversion. Because officers just weren't using PAD, we were like, well, can you give them something? If they divert somebody, can you multiply that by 5, right? Instead of multiplying arrests by 5. So this is, and I think I only have a couple of slides left so we can have some conversation. These sort of like plugging a hole in the boat and then another one springs up here, this whack-a-mole of reform can also produce more harm. So people are obsessed with requiring officers to fire warning shots and requiring officers to intervene. Yes, that's important, right? But that's just what we teach our kids. You see someone mistreating your friend, step in, go tell a teacher. This should not be something that we have to tell public servants. But even in Minneapolis, after the first sort of groundswell of Black Lives Matter movement, they had a duty to intervene requirement. Breonna Taylor was killed despite a warning before shooting policy. Those policies alone will not save lives. If we do not shrink the size of the state, if we do not require our communities to be less saturated by militarized police forces, we will continue to see this violence. And it is because, in part, the function, and it kind of goes back to the beginning, the function of policing is to exact social control on certain communities in this country. My mom, we were talking one day and she said, well, you can't get rid of police. The world will go crazy. And I said, well, Mom, because she always talks about this one Black police officer in this small town she grew up, Camden, Arkansas. And his name was Buckshot. Well, not was, he's still alive. And he keeps getting all these awards, right? He was Camden's lone Black police officer because remember, Black police officers, even in the city of Atlanta, could not arrest white people. And I said, did you feel safe when you were growing up? She said, yes. And I said, did you have police, patrolling your block every hour? She said, no. I said, you lived in a police-free community. And so that is a demonstration of what happens because her town also had the resources to take care of one another, right? They had relationships. They had cooperatives, even though that's not what they called it then. They had farm to table. They had all of these things that we pay all of these big bucks for now. Communities can have and build for themselves, but they can't do it without resources. And one of the places you can pull those resources from are bloated police budgets. And in Atlanta, this isn't the case, but are often backed by really scary unions that say do this or else. And the politicians that are funded by bail bonds companies, there is big money in incarceration, and we care about people who have experienced harm. And so we do death penalty litigation. So you would guess that at Southern Center, our clients are accused of doing heinous things. But we also have been able to build relationships with communities of survivors of harm who say that the state should not be killing people, right? And they're able to find justice other ways. And so what we in our strategic plan are doing, looking forward over the next 5 years, is building stronger relationships with other people who have survived harm in their communities and find community solutions to address the harm instead of resorting to caging people because that's how we got here to the age of mass incarceration. So this is my contact information at Southern Center. And then I have a whole bunch of tabs open. So during the Q&A, I can start to drop toolkits and other resources for some more robust reading on this Invest by Vest framework.
Tiffany, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Do you have a list of action items that you can share with our group right now? This is just amazing.
Yes. So the first thing is look at your city's police budget and talk to your city council about non-law enforcement responses to harm. And I'll drop the links for the models. You can look at the CAHOOTS model, and you can even look at the Use of Force Advisory Council report out of the city of Atlanta. But if you have a governmental agency that is interested in that, there are a lot of places, well, during COVID, maybe not a lot of places to visit, but there are a lot of places you can look. The second thing I would recommend is to look at the Police Free Schools campaigns. It's called Police Free Schools. I'll drop the link. And determine what your school system is currently doing with respect to resource officers. Unfortunately, in Atlanta, we have just expanded our school police force. But there are cities that are being really successful in pulling dollars from the resource officer budget and reallocating that to wraparound services for students who are either experiencing harm or causing harm on their peers. Those are two really easy places to start. And then the third thing I always say is to join an organization or to support an organization that is doing this work. Our Southern Center, we have a fundraiser coming up, but I'm pretty sure you can watch, well, don't quote me, I think you can watch it for free. But to support organizations that do the work of taking people out of cages and giving them the care that they need. Women on the Rise is another organization. Arch City Defenders, but supporting or joining the general body of an organization working with communities who are experiencing violent policing and state violence.
Thank you for those. And I have one question before we open the floor for questions. Do you have sister organizations with the Southern Center for Human Rights? Are they located all over the US, or is yours the only one?
So yes, Southern Center is the only Southern Center, but we do have sister organizations. So Arch City Defenders in St. Louis was modeled after the Southern Center model. They're friends of ours. Southern Poverty Law Center is also an organization we work a lot with. Civil Rights Corps, Legal Action Center, are other organizations that we work with. We actually have a coalition of over 50 organizations that do the work around criminal legal reform. And we work also with Movement for Black Lives, who of course launched the Defund the Police campaign this summer.
Thank you for that. So we will take questions now. If you would like to ask a question, I know Lindsay is burning with a question. And for those of you who would like to ask questions, if you would type them in or just queue up for next, we will make sure that your questions get asked and answered.
Okay, I have two questions. I'm sorry. I was just full of them, but I only thought to write down 1.5. So, can you rewind for a second to the